When a middle-ranking aristocrat with very little to recommend him, he having very little wealth or ability, with looks that routinely made him the butt of everyone else's jokes, absent-mindedly declared his love for a particular type of food, he had no idea that this would begin a chain of events that would lead him on the journey of his life. Over the course of this journey, he also came to learn that you should never judge a book by its cover, and that there are men out there in the world with very strange powers and even stranger senses of humor. Yokoso owashitare, and welcome back to another ancient Japanese folktale. And if you like Japanese history and culture, or just storytelling in general, please give the video a like and subscribe, because I put a new tales video on here every week for your education and enjoyment. And with all of that out of the way, let's continue with the tale. Once upon a time, imawa mukashi. There was a man who occupied the office of shogun by the name of Toshihito. Now, before any of you get any ideas, this was not the famous position of shogun as most of you might think of it, which specifically was called the Seitai shogun. This shogun was simply a decently high court position that was held by this man at this time. He was definitely not the military dictator of the country. That position wouldn't even resemble its final form for another 100 years or so. Now, this Toshihito had a nickname when in his youth that the text is missing because these are old stories and the documents that they were originally written on have deteriorated and made it impossible to know what some of the characters are. Toshihito himself actually served under an Ichi no Hito, which means a number one person, i.e. the most powerful man in the country who wasn't a member of the royal family. But while he served a very powerful man, what's more important to this story is that his father-in-law was a man by the name of Arihito, who lived a good way from the capital in the province of Echizen. Now, the way marriages worked at the time is that when a man married a woman, the woman stayed living with her parents, and the man would ostensibly move in with his wife's family. In exchange for a place to live, a wife, and all the help raising his kids, the man was then expected to represent his in-laws in court. Because of this, Toshihito, while being a high-ranking capital aristocrat himself, he would regularly head out to Echizen and spend lots of time there at his in-laws' house / his wife's house / now his house. But all of that is just necessary context for the rest of this story, because our story actually begins at the residence of Toshihito's lord, who, in order to celebrate the new year, was hosting a massive party. Now, the custom at these big parties was that after all the high-ranking important people finished having their fill of food, they would then send the leftovers around the residence so the help could eat. And that's exactly how this party went as well. Once the feast was over, the leftovers were distributed among the help. One of them being a servant of the 5th rank who had served in this house for many, many years. Now, I need to mention here that in the Heian aristocratic ranking, ranks 1, 2, and 3 were all considered high nobility. Rank 4 was decently prestigious rank, but everyone below that was definitely considered by the high nobility as servants, and not that worth paying attention to, if the fact that they only got to eat the leftovers at big parties didn't clue you in on that already. Now, this 5th rank samurai here simply meaning servant and not member of the warrior aristocracy. We're having to explain a lot of words today, aren't we? Now, this samurai was hanging out amongst some of the other low-ranking samurai as they ate some of these party leftovers. This 5th rank guy, let's call him Phil, 5th rank Phil, that's what we'll go with, was very enthusiastically slurping up a bowl of imogayu. Now, imogayu basically was a kind of porridge they made from a Japanese yam or a Japanese sweet potato, and imo is what it's called. Now, as he was going to town on some of this imogayu, his slurping was so enthusiastic that it ended up catching Toshihito's attention, who watched him as he downed the last bit of porridge and then very loudly and contentedly declared, "Oh boy, I could eat all the imogayu in the world and never be satisfied. This stuff is the best." Toshihito, with a slight grin, replied, "Sir Tairyu, or Sir Taifu, I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce it, and I believe Taifu or Tairyu was like his rank, I guess. Sir Tairyu, are you still wanting more imogayu?" Taifu Phil then put down his now empty bowl and replied, "Indeed, sir, I would love more." Toshihito's grin then widened slightly and he said, "Well, one day, I would love to have your taste and hunger for imogayu satisfied." 5th rank Phil, suspecting nothing, was simply happy to have such a powerful man acknowledge his presence and simply replied, "Well, sir, if you did so for me, that would make me a very happy man indeed." And then at this, their conversation ended and they each went their separate ways. Now at this point, I have to explain yet one more thing about how the Japanese language works here. The word they use is aku, which means to be satisfied. Now when Phil says that he could never be satisfied, his exact words were something like, how could I ever akamu? I.e., how could I ever be satisfied? Meaning that he felt like he could eat imogayu until he died and still want more. Toshihito, when he says that he wants to satisfy this man, he says something like, I want to akase tatematsura baya, which means something like, I want to humbly cause you to be satisfied. Now this is actually important for what happens later in the story, so please, just remember it, put that in the back of your mind, save it for later. Now, 4 or 5 days after this little exchange between these two men, one day, Phil was hanging around this same residence with some free time, when Toshihito, who apparently was also still hanging around, showed up and made his way over to him. Good sir, I have a request for you. You see, out in the eastern hills is a place where some natural hot springs are. It would please me greatly if you would do me the honor of accompanying me to them. 5th rank Phil, once again, simply grateful that such a well-to-do man was not only engaging with him, but also inviting him to come to what could possibly be some private property to indulge in some top-tier hot springs. Man, he must have hit the jackpot of luck, or something. And so, Phil then responded, now grinning, the honor and pleasure would be mine, sir. I've actually been having trouble sleeping lately because of some very bad itching, and I think a soak in some hot springs would do me wonders. There's just one problem, though. I have nothing to ride, and it is surely a long way. Toshihito then said, no need to worry about that. I have some horses for the both of us. Phil then replied, wonderful. I am in your debt, my lord. Now at this point, the text sees fit to give a very detailed and very unflattering description of 5th rank Phil. It says that he only wore 2 very thin cotton outer robes, which I'm guessing was considered lacking by more well-to-do people, and some pale blue sashinuki pants that were worn and tattered slightly around the edges. Beneath these articles of clothing, he had an ill-fitting kariginu and no under hakama. So basically, he wasn't exactly wearing the ancient Japanese version of Prada, which might not seem like a big deal until you realize that he lived in the capital and was surrounded by people who did all the time and who would judge you based on how nice your clothes were. The text then also comments on his most notable physical feature, which was his nose. It was abnormally long and high, the tip of which was always slightly redder than the rest of it, and it always seemed like he needed a tissue to clean up after the near-constant sheen near his nostrils. The text then jumps back to his clothes, pointing out that his obi, the little belt-like thing that tied the various layers of kimono together, was always loose and off-center. And this visage, the text says, was a constant source of derisive laughter from those who laid eyes upon this man. However, none of this seemed to bother Toshihito, who promptly brought some horses, had Phil follow behind him, and then set out in the direction of the Kamo River to the east of the capital. Now Phil had no servants with him, not even a page boy, while Toshihito had one guy to carry some of his weapons, aristocrats gotta have weapons even if they're only for show, and another guy to just run random errands coming along with him. By and by, this little party made it to a place called Kuritaguchi, and while I'm not sure where this place is, my guess it was actually a little bit deeper into the eastern hills than Phil was expecting, because he eventually felt the need to ask, sir? Where exactly is our destination? To which Toshihito only smiled and answered, oh, we're pretty close. So on they went until they passed a place called Yamashina, which was not so close, even to Kuritaguchi, the place they were just at. And so Phil asked yet again, sir, you said that the place was close, but now we've passed Yamashina. What gives? Toshihito only smiled again and said, oh, don't worry, it's just up ahead. But on and on they went until they passed an even more distant place called Sekiyama and arrived at the home of a Buddhist priest who served at the temple of Miidera, which was, and I quote, crazy far from the capital. But whatever, they had arrived and Phil was now looking forward to enjoying some all-natural hot springs. That is, until he looked around, saw no signs that there were hot springs at this place at all, as the priest who was working there turned to the party and said, oh, hello sirs, What a surprise, I was not expecting company. Now, Phil was doubly confused. Wouldn't Toshihito have sent someone ahead to prep everything for them if they were truly going to enjoy some hot springs? What was going on? But not wanting to impute Toshihito's intentions, Phil then asked, "So, where are the hot springs?" Toshihito then answered, "To tell you the truth, sir, I've actually brought you here to Tsuruga for the time being." Phil was now getting frustrated, and he retorted a bit curtly, "My lord, had you said that we were going to be coming all the way to Tsuruga when we were back in the city, I would have brought a servant or two with me for protection. How do you expect me to continue traveling such a long road without being properly prepared? It's rather nerve-wracking." At this little outburst, Toshihito let out a full, hearty laugh and said, "On that account, sir, you need not worry. Consider me worth 1,000 regular guardsmen." Now, this didn't really put Phil's mind at ease, and he was genuinely starting to wonder if Toshihito was a little bit crazy. But here they were, and Phil wasn't about to head back completely alone and run into heaven only knows what on the road. And so here, the party had a lunch break, and after they finished eating, they set off again. Toshihito then took his weapons from his servant and carried them himself. And so off they went. Where to? Phil had no idea, but they weren't going to hot springs. Or were they? Who knows? But not long after they set out, they came to a place called Mitsu Beach, Mitsunohama, and as they were going along like normal, suddenly a single fox sprang out of the bush and ran off in front of them. This was a bit surprising, understandably, but what was more surprising is that Toshihito declared in a loud, excited voice, "It seems a useful servant has shown up." And before Phil could ask what the heck Toshihito meant by that, Toshihito spurred his horse on and started chasing this fox down. Not knowing what else to do, Phil spurred his horse on in pursuit. It was clear that the fox was desperate to escape and fleeing with all its might, but was clearly no match for Toshihito's horse, which although it actually didn't look like anything special, was in reality one of the best horses around, and it quickly closed the gap on this fox. It was here that Toshihito fell to the horse's belly is the exact quote, which I'm guessing means that he did a riding trick where he was hanging off the horse's side. He then snatched this fox by the back legs, pulled himself back up into the saddle with this fox just helplessly hanging there, unable to escape. Phil managed to catch up with Toshihito right as he glared at this fox and bellowed in a commanding voice, "You, fox, go to my house here in Tsuruga within the evening and give my people this message. The Lord Toshihito is bringing a guest from the capital. Have a group of men and 2 fresh horses brought to Takashima by the hour of the snake, which is around 10 a.m. in our time, and I dare you, little fox, to test me and not do as I say. You foxes are magic and can shapeshift, so I expect you to arrive by nightfall and have everything done exactly as I've said." With that, Toshihito then let the fox go. Meanwhile, Phil just kind of watched this whole thing, awestruck, and not really knowing what to do or say, managed to awkwardly stammer out, half-jokingly, well, sir, you certainly seem to have many, wide-ranging servants." Toshihito then only smiled at him and answered, "Just you wait and see, sir. There's no way he'll refuse to follow my orders." No sooner had Toshihito finished these words than the fox scurried off ahead, stopping multiple times to timidly look back until it vanished into the brush. That night, the party camped outside. Phil probably trying to process everything that had happened that day, and wishing that he had been prepared for this crazy journey he now found himself on. When morning came, the party set out early, and after going a few hours, the hour of the snake arrived. And right around that time, Phil noticed, off in the distance, a group of people moving steadily toward them. And just as Phil began wondering who it was this group of people could be, and what they were doing, again bandits and brigands were a real threat, he heard Toshihito say, "Ah, it seems the fox did his job and passed on my message. Those are my men coming this way." Phil didn't believe him though. There was no way Toshihito got a fox to deliver a message to his men, and they were now sallying forth to meet them. Clearly, Toshihito was actually just crazy. But as they drew closer to this group of people and Phil could see them more clearly, they certainly looked like servants and not bandits or brigands. And then they got close enough for their voices to reach each other. at which point these strange men hopped off of their horses with one accord, and Phil heard one of them shout, "Look, the Lord really is here." Phil was stunned. There was no way. But sure enough, Toshihito just laughed like he knew these men and said, "Well, well, what do we have here?" At which one of the men, who had a commanding air about him, stepped forward. Toshihito then asked, "Did you bring horses?" To which the boss-looking man replied, "Yes, my lord. We have 2 of them for both you and your guest." The men then produced some food, and Phil, Toshihito, the servants they had brought from the capital, and all these new servants all had brunch on the road. It was during this little break that Phil overheard the boss-looking man say to Toshihito, "You know, my lord, something strange happened back at the house last night." Toshihito, feigning ignorance and still smiling, raised his eyebrows and said, "Is that so? What exactly was it that happened?" The boss-looking guy, who was clearly one of Toshihito's retainers, said with all respect, but very animatedly, and I'm going to try to make this easy to follow, but it's about a guy talking about a fox, talking about Toshihito, talking about what he wants the fox to say to the guy, so it might be a little confusing. Well, you see, sir, around the hour of the dog, which I guess is around 8 or 9 p.m., I was about my business when suddenly the lady of the house started complaining of chest pains. As soon as I started to wonder what could be wrong, she began speaking to me in a strange voice and said, "I am a fox, and not who you think I am. I ran into the Lord Toshihito on the road near Mitsu Beach as he was on his way back up from the capital. I tried to run from him, but he chased me down and snatched me up and told me, 'You are to make it back to my house before the night is up and pass on a message. Tell the men that I am bringing a surprise guest from the capital, and they are to saddle 2 fresh horses for both me and my guest, and meet us at Takashima tomorrow at the hour of the snake. If you fail to do this, I promise you will have a very, very bad time. So please, sirs, ready yourselves and do as Toshihito instructed, or I am going to meet an unbearable fate.' The lady, sir, who I guess was not actually the lady but a shape-shifting fox, told me about your coming with such fear and anxiety in its voice that I determined that it was indeed true. I then gathered the men together, had 2 horses prepared as instructed, and immediately set out with the others to Takashima. And sure enough, my lord, we ran into you and your honored guest here exactly as the fox said." Once the retainer had finished explaining the story, Toshihito did what he always did and simply laughed. Phil, on the other hand, couldn't believe that this was a thing. Even this retainer, with whom Toshihito had no correspondence with at all, was talking like Toshihito could command magical shape-shifting foxes. Who was this man? And why was he such an absolute Chad? Once they finished their brunch, the whole party, now including all of the capable retainers of Toshihito's house, all set off again. On and on they went, all day and into the evening, until finally they arrived at Toshihito's home just after dark. As soon as they arrived and crossed the gate into the house garden, Phil heard the whole place burst into activity, and people here and there shouting, "It's true! Lord Toshihito is here!" When Phil dismounted his horse and had a chance to have a good look around the place, he first noted how busy the place was. This man was a man who had all the hired help anyone could want, i.e., a very wealthy and powerful man. Toshihito then invited Phil into the house, who had actually been wearing an extra noshi, a kind of outer robe that Toshihito had lent him because it had actually been a bit chilly as of late. Despite Toshihito's generosity though, it was clear that the wind still cut through even the 3 layers of clothes that he was wearing, and so the servants of the house very quickly ushered Phil inside, got a fire going for him, and laid out some tatami mats next to it, and then brought him some exquisite food and drink. One of the servants then remarked, "You must have been freezing the whole way here. Please, take these." And then they wrapped Phil in 3 layers of thick, brand new cotton robes. Needless to say, Phil was on cloud 9 and having an excellent time now. After everyone had finished eating and things around the house quieted down, Toshihito's father-in-law, again a man by the name of Arihito, who technically was the guy who owned the house because again, when a man married a woman, he moved in with her and her family. But this man, Arihito, showed up to greet both his son-in-law and this new guest that they were now hosting. Upon arriving in their room and exchanging salutations, father-in-law Arihito turned to Toshihito and said in a mildly joking manner, What in the world possessed you to head this way from the capital so suddenly? Your main man suddenly started acting all crazy last night, and your wife started complaining about her chest hurting. It's been a very strange and very unusual couple of days." In typical fashion, Toshihito simply laughed and replied, "Well, I was curious and wanted to test if the fox would do what I said, and it looks like he did exactly as I wanted." And now it was Akihito's turn to laugh, and he replied, "Ha, what a strange occurrence." Arihito then turned to Phil and asked, "I presume this gentleman here is the guest that your fox friend was referring to, yes?" Toshihito answered with a nod. "Indeed it is. The other day he said that he could eat all the imogayu till the end of time and never be satisfied. Well, I decided I wanted to take him up on that challenge, and brought him here." Arihito then, still grinning, replied, "Well, won't that be an easy challenge to meet?" At this point, Phil found a chance to chime in and explained, "Well, you see, sir, my lord Toshihito here tricked me into coming all this way, saying that we were going to go to some hot springs in the eastern hills." Now, I don't know what Phil said after that, but these three men continued talking well into the night, and with Toshihito and Arihito cracking jokes the whole time. But once it turned late, Arihito excused himself and everyone went to their several places of sleep. Phil was then led to a very nice-looking bedroom, and laid down after donning a fourth outer robe called a hitatare, over the three other robes that he had gotten when arriving at this place. Now, if you remember early in the story, Phil mentioned having trouble sleeping because he was always itchy. Well, now he had a whole new set of clothes that were exquisite, super nice, super fantastic, and all of that old itchy clothing he had thrown away. The problem was, he wasn't used to wearing this nice of clothing, or at least this much of it. So while he was trying to sleep, he grew really, really hot, and started sweating, despite it being so cold outside. Now, I should also point out here that they didn't have blankets at this time. Instead, they just kind of used their oversized clothing as both blankets at night and day wear when they were up and about. And I guess Phil didn't want to remove his clothes to help cool himself down. So instead, he just laid there, struggling to sleep. It was at this point that Phil heard the sound of someone come into the room. He instantly sat straight up and said, "Who's there?" He was answered by a soft, feminine voice that said, and here we get into a bit of risque territory, be ye warned, "I was ordered to come and give you a foot massage, sir." Now, if you're thinking that this is somewhat suggestive, I'm pretty sure it is, because the text says that Phil found this woman's voice very appealing and came close to her and laid down with her at a place where the breeze could come in and easily cool him. Now, the text doesn't explicitly say that they did anything of a naughty nature, but then the Tale of Genji never explicitly says anything happens like that either, but there's a lot of hanky-panky going on in that story. So basically, it's quite probable that Phil and this woman engaged in that kind of activity, if you know what I mean. Regardless of whether they did or not long after this woman showed up, Phil fell asleep. But then he was soon woken up by the sound of someone out on the ground shouting, "To all the servants in the area, you are to each bring an imo," again, a Japanese tuber or a Japanese sweet potato, "at least 3 sun thick and 5 shaku long, and place them here by the hour of the rabbit by tomorrow morning." Which, to say in words that make a little more sense to us, bring some massive sweet potatoes by 6 in the morning. Now, when Phil heard this, he was still half asleep, so his brain didn't really process it beyond thinking, what a weird thing to say. And then he immediately fell back asleep. Sometime really early in the morning, before it was even dawn, however, Phil was awakened yet again by the sound of people laying out some mats in the garden. It was close enough to morning that he probably wasn't going to be able to fall back asleep, so instead, he decided to see what the noise was all about. And so, once there was enough light in the sky that he could see, at least a little bit, he lifted the blinds that surrounded the place where he was sleeping and looked out over the grounds. He saw a group of servants laying out 4 or 5 mats on the grass. And just as he wondered what they were doing that for, another servant brought what looked like a big stick and laid it on one of the mats and then left. Not long after, another servant appeared and did the same thing. And then another, and another. And as the sky grew lighter and Phil could see more, he realized that these weren't sticks that these servants were bringing, but rather really, really big imo, again aka sweet potatoes. The servants kept bringing more and more of these imo for at least a couple of hours, until they had a pile of them, almost reaching the roof of the building that Phil was staying in. It was at this point that Phil remembered the voice he had heard last night, and he put two and two together and realized that this was what that voice had been shouting about last night. And it seemed like that order had made it to every able-bodied hand in the area. Even still, the fact that they were able to collect so many sweet potatoes in such a short time was astounding, and served to demonstrate just how rich and powerful of a man Toshihito actually was. Phil then watched as the servants next brought about 6 massive cauldrons, pounded some stakes into the ground, and then set these cauldrons on top of these stakes. Phil again wondered what all of this was for. And then he saw a group of good-looking young servant women wearing some very nice pure white clothing, bearing white buckets full of water. And they began filling these cauldrons with that same water. Phil at first assumed that they were going to boil it, but then realized that they hadn't actually brought water to these cauldrons, but this sweet liquid concoction called misen that was actually quite valuable, and, wouldn't you know it, is one of the key ingredients to making imogayu. At around the same time, a group of young men showed up, carrying some very fine cutting implements, and began slicing up these sweet potatoes. It was here that Phil finally realized that everything he had seen and heard over the past several hours was all because they were preparing some of the finest imogayu anyone could ever imagine. And yet, despite it being his favorite food, Phil was not only not in the mood to eat some, but found the whole thing rather distasteful. I mean, think about it. This would imply that this whole thing, bringing Phil down from the capital, sending him on this wild goose chase, this was all just some massive joke, one big joke that Toshihito was playing on Phil. Though as far as pranks go, getting a new set of nice clothing, free meals, and some nice women's company, I mean, there are certainly worse pranks out there, let's be honest. Of course, after a short time, the imogayu was finished, and when the servants reported to Toshihito, he ordered them to have it served to Phil. I won't go into the measurements because it's actually hard for me to follow myself, but basically, they got a really fancy yet incredibly massive silver bowl, filled it with imogayu, and then brought it to Phil. Phil, again realizing that this whole thing was a joke at his expense, and being put off by it, simply said, "No, I'm satisfied." At this, Toshihito burst into the most energetic laughter you had ever heard. And after he managed to compose himself, he turned to all of the servants and said, still obviously finding this whole thing hilarious, "Because of the excellent virtue of our distinguished guest, we all get to chow down on some imogayu." And at this, a bunch of the servants then started laughing as well. Now, if you remember at the beginning of the story, Toshihito vowed to cause the main character Phil to be satisfied of imogayu. And again, using that word aku, or rather when Toshihito used it, akase tatematsura baya. Now, at this moment, when Phil said, "I'm satisfied," he used the same word, aki ni tari, meaning that he had no intention of eating any of it. But Toshihito's whole shtick in doing this is that he wanted to get this guy to declare that he no longer wanted to eat imogayu, because in the beginning of the story, if you remember, Phil said something to the effect of, "How could I ever akamu, or ever be satisfied with eating imogayu?" i.e., how could I ever grow sick of eating it? Again, it was basically one massive joke to make this guy, who claimed he could never grow tired of the stuff, actually grow tired of the stuff. Now, while everyone was having a good laugh at Phil's expense, the fox that they had all seen a day or two ago, the one that had brought Toshihito's message, poked his head out from around the side of one of the buildings that was off to the side. Toshihito noticed this fox and then loudly declared to Phil, "Look, sir, the fox from the other day has come to see what's happening. Someone, please, get this poor creature some of this imogayu. There's plenty to go around." One of the servants then scooped some into a bowl, brought it over to the fox, and set it on the ground. The fox then very nervously came over, lapped it up, and then darted off into the brush. And so, Phil spent the next month or so staying at Toshihito's place, enjoying, and I quote, "innumerable amusing things." Basically, if you were feeling sorry for Phil because he had a practical joke played on him, you honestly don't need to. Toshihito got his laughs in, true, But if sharing some of this food with a fox and his generally fabulous treatment of Phil didn't tip you off, Toshihito was actually a really nice guy, and just felt like he wanted to have some fun while rewarding Phil for his years of good service. And reward him he did. Because when they finally set out to return to the capital, Toshihito lavished Phil with all sorts of very, very nice gifts, including tons of clothing, which again, served almost as money in their society. And these clothes were made of cotton, silk, leather, and any other material that they used to make clothing. Furthermore, Toshihito gave Phil a very, very nice horse with one of the finest saddles money could buy, and basically made sure that Phil showed up in the capital in a much, much better financial situation than when he had left. And the story then ends with a moral. And thus is it said that for those who faithfully serve according to their station for many, many years, they will surely one day be rewarded in a similar manner by their superiors. And that's the end of the story. I'm not going to comment too much on because this is actually a little bit longer. I debated whether or not splitting this up into 2 parts, but I decided, you know what, I'm going to put it into 1 and see how it does, and hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Maybe, depending on your reaction to it and how well it's received, I might make the next really long story into parts. I might continue splitting it up, or I might just do the extra work to make each individual story actually one story, one video, and just go with that. I don't know. We'll see. It depends. But please, if you enjoyed this story, please give the video a like. Please subscribe to the channel because there are plenty more stories where this one came from. And please tell me in the comments what you thought about this. Again, I'm always very interested in like the moral implications of what goes on here. Like the morals of the ancient Japanese as opposed to our own. Again, on the one hand, I feel a little bit bad for Phil, 5th ranked Phil here, because he obviously was having a massive practical joke played on him. He didn't sign up for any of this. However, he was rewarded greatly because of it. So, was Toshihito a bad guy? Was he a good guy? He wanted to reward this guy, but he also wanted to get some practical jokes in because, as you can tell through this whole story, he just really likes laughing and having a good time. But, you know, maybe he could do that a little less at the expense of other people. But again, maybe it's not that big of a deal. I don't know. You just let me know what you guys think. Anyway, if you've been watching all the way up to the end here, I thank you sincerely. Ito kataji ke no koso haberi kere. And hopefully we will see you for the next story about a thief and a very, very good guy. Anyways, thanks so much, guys. We'll catch you later. Goodbye.